the fire beneath the sky. 74,000 years ago, the Earth trembled under a force so great that even our modern imagination struggles to capture its scale. In what is now Sumatra, Indonesia, a supervolcano known as Toba exploded with a violence that dwarfs every volcanic eruption witnessed in human history. It hurled billions of tons of ash, gas and molten rock into the sky, creating a plume that climbed higher than the cruising altitude of jets we take for granted today. For a moment in time, the sky itself was aflame, and the fragile balance of life across the globe was thrown into chaos. Scientists who study this event estimate that Toba's eruption was up to 5,000 times more powerful than the 1980 blast of Mount St. Helens in the United States. The caldera it left behind yawns nearly 100 kilometers across. Today it is filled by the tranquil waters of Lake Toba, a deceptively serene reminder of the cataclysm. But in those days, nothing about it was serene. The eruption darkened skies across continents, sending fine ash drifting as far as Africa. The earth shuddered, and with it, the fate of our species hung by a thread. Archaeologists and climatologists tell us that the eruption may have triggered a volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted by several degrees, and the planet entered a long cold spell that choked forests, dried rivers, and stripped away the food webs that sustained both animals and humans. Some scholars have suggested that this event reduced the entire human population to a few thousand breeding individuals, a genetic bottleneck so tight that every person alive today may trace ancestry to those who endured it. Others, however, argue that the devastation may not have been as uniform. Perhaps pockets of humanity were better shielded from the ash and cold, clinging on in more forgiving refuges. Scholars still debate whether Toba truly pushed our ancestors to the brink of extinction, or whether its reach, though terrifying, was more patchwork than total. Yet beyond numbers and data, it is worth imagining the lived experience of those who faced it. Imagine being a hunter-gatherer in Africa or South Asia when the skies dimmed. The sun that once guided the day grew faint, its warmth dulled. Mornings brought a choking haze, evenings fell earlier than before. The animals your people relied upon, herds of antelope, birds, even the fish in rivers, vanished or grew thin. Each sunrise was no longer a promise of life, but a question mark. Would there be food? Would the cold tighten its grip? Would your children live to see another season? There are whispers, too, from folklore across cultures, echoes of firestorms, endless nights, and rebirth after catastrophe. While we cannot prove that these myths remember Toba directly, they remind us that humanity's oldest stories often circle around fire and darkness. One fringe idea even suggests that the myth of a great flood in later traditions may have its roots in the long rains and disrupted climates that followed the eruption. Perhaps memory, carried in tales around firesides, has stretched across tens of millennia, keeping alive a trace of that primordial terror. And so, the stage was set, the world convulsed, the air grew thick, and the very survival of humankind became a desperate wager against the earth itself. Amid this backdrop of fire and ash, one small tribe, insignificant in number, yet immeasurably important to our shared story, began the long and fragile struggle to endure, ash blanket over the world. The eruption did not end when the mountain quieted. In truth, it was only the beginning. As the days turned to weeks, and the weeks into years, the true reach of the catastrophe revealed itself. The earth's skies, once blue and alive with birds, became a shifting veil of grey. Fine volcanic ash, lighter than sand, sharp as glass, spread outwards, circling the globe in a slow-motion storm that had no end. Across Asia and Africa, archaeologists find layers of this ash preserved even today, as though the earth itself took a snapshot of that moment in time. In parts of India, for example, a sheet of Toba ash more than 15 centimeters thick lies buried beneath soil. When modern researchers cut into it, they uncover a pale scar in the ground, a frozen reminder of the day the world darkened. Imagine what that meant for those who breathed it. Ash clogging streams, coating leaves, and filling the lungs of animals and humans alike. The ecosystem collapsed in eerie silence. Herds that once thundered across the savannas disappeared. Forests, deprived of sunlight, withered into skeletal groves. Insects vanished, birds fell quiet. It was not a single blow like the impact of an asteroid, but a lingering suffocation of the natural order. What little food remained was toxic or spoiled, buried beneath a layer of grit. This was the volcanic winter, a phrase that sounds almost poetic, but in truth describes years of famine, cold, and dim light. Mainstream science tells us that temperatures may have dropped several degrees across the planet, enough to shorten growing seasons and kill fragile ecosystems. Some fringe researchers, however, argue that temperatures may have plunged even lower, describing a near ice age that lasted nearly a millennium. Scholars still debate whether this was a uniform global crisis or whether regions far from Toba, like coastal Africa, were spared the worst. Yet even the mildest interpretation leaves little doubt. Humanity's road grew narrower than ever before. For those living through it, the world must have seemed broken. Picture waking to find rivers shallow, their fish floating belly up, or walking through forests where leaves crumble to dust at your touch. The air itself stung with fine ash, cutting the throat, burning the eyes. And over all of it hung the silence, the absence of animal calls, the retreat of wind beneath a heavy, stagnant sky. Quirky theories have even suggested that this global blanket of ash may have inspired some of humanity's first experiments with symbolic art. In South Africa's Blombos Cave, archaeologists have found ochre engravings dating roughly to this same period. Some fringe voices propose that, in a world stripped bare of colour and light, early humans turned inward, carving meaning into stone because the outer world felt too hostile to provide it. Whether true or not, it sparks the imagination, art as an act of defiance against extinction. And yet, survival was possible. Not easy, not comfortable, but possible. Pockets of life endured, where ash fell thinner or rivers ran clearer. In the heart of these bleak years, one small tribe, clinging to the edge of existence, began to weave together the habits and strategies that would carry them through. Each fire they lit, each scrap of food they found, was not merely a meal or a moment of warmth. It was a gamble, one more fragile thread in the great unravelling tapestry of human survival. The tribe at the edge. Amid this wounded world, one small band of humans pressed on. They were neither mighty warriors nor rulers of vast lands, but ordinary gatherers and hunters whose lives now became a daily test of endurance. Picture a group of perhaps 20 or 30 souls, men, women and children, huddled near the edge of a river swollen with ash, where fish still darted in shallow pools. Their camp was a scatter of hides stretched across wooden frames, stones blackened with soot, and the faint glow of fire struggling against the damp air. Anthropologists today suggest that many surviving groups in this period lived not in large societies, but in tiny clans. Genetic evidence indicates that humanity's numbers may have shrunk to as few as several thousand breeding individuals worldwide. That is fewer than the number of people in a small town today. The tribe we imagine here, whether real or symbolic, was one of those fragile lifeboats of humanity, adrift in an ocean of ash and cold. Mainstream archaeology points to refugees in Africa, particularly along the southern coast, where the sea's resources offered a measure of stability. Mussel shells, fish bones, and remnants of fire pits discovered at sites like Pinnacle Point suggest that people turned to the ocean when the land failed them. A quirky but fascinating detail. Researchers believe these early coastal foragers may have roasted shellfish on heated stones, perhaps one of the oldest examples of what we might cheekily call barbecue. Yet even here, survival was not guaranteed. Storms battered the coast, ash tainted freshwater sources, and game animals grew scarce. What held the tribe together was not only food and shelter, but kinship. Imagine nights when the cold pressed in, and the people of this tribe gathered close around a fire. The children, too young to remember a brighter world, leaned against their mother's shoulders. The hunters, weary from fruitless chases, sharpened their stone blades in silence, and the elders, keepers of memory, whispered reminders of how things once were, stories of sunlit forests and rivers teeming with life. In those stories lay something more precious than food: hope. Yet hope was fragile. Every dawn forced hard choices. Who would search for roots among the withered brush? Who would risk a journey across the barren hills in search of deer tracks? Who would stay behind to guard the young? At times, hunger twisted these decisions into desperate gambles. Archaeologists studying bone remains from this era have found signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, brittle skeletons, teeth worn down by chewing on fibrous plants, and even bones. Scholars still debate whether cannibalism, whispered in the darker corners of paleoanthropology, emerged in some groups as starvation deepened. While evidence is thin, the very fact that the question lingers speaks to the extremity of the age. But if hunger tested their bodies, trust tested their spirits. For a tribe this small, betrayal or conflict could be fatal. Cooperation became as vital as fire. One broken bond might mean fewer hunters, fewer gatherers, fewer arms to carry wood or children. The tribe learned to lean into the strength of the group, not the individual. Anthropologists today argue that such crucibles of crisis may have been the birthplace of deeper social bonds, the root of empathy and cooperation that defines us as humans. And so, on the edge of collapse, the tribe endured. They were not secure, they were not safe, but they were alive. Each night the fire burned was a statement against the darkness. We are still here. In their fragile circle of warmth and kinship, the seed of humanity's survival was planted, even if they could not yet know it. Hunger and hollow days. The days stretched thin, each one a fragile bridge between survival and collapse. Food had become the central obsession of the tribe. No longer could they rely on the herds that once thundered across open plains, or the dense groves that had offered fruit. Instead, survival meant scraping nourishment from whatever the wounded land grudgingly provided. Hunger was no longer an occasional visitor, it was a constant, a dull ache that pressed on the body and clouded the mind. Archaeological evidence from sites in East Africa suggests that during periods of scarcity, early humans relied heavily on roots, tubers, and bulbs. These plants, hidden underground, offered calories when leaves and fruit were gone. Imagine the tribe's women and older children kneeling in the ashy soil, scraping with digging sticks, their fingers numb, prying up bitter roots. These were not feasts, but sustenance that kept bones upright and hearts beating. Often, the roots had to be roasted to drive out toxins, a reminder that even food was not freely given. Bones, too, were broken open for their marrow. Archaeologists at sites like Classes River in South Africa have uncovered cracked antelope bones, evidence of desperate extraction of every last calorie. In times of plenty, marrow might have been a delicacy. In times like these, it was the difference between life and death. Even the smallest fragments were not wasted. Fire, too, became an ally in this grim economy. Ash-coated meat and roots could be smoked to last another day. Yet scarcity also sparked invention. Some fringe researchers suggest that hunger may have pushed humans to experiment with new foods: shellfish, insects, even seaweed. resources that had been overlooked in easier times. Scholars still debate whether these dietary shifts were temporary measures or the beginnings of a new, more diverse subsistence strategy too. Hat would later fuel human expansion. What is certain is that necessity became the harshest of teachers. But the hollow days did not test bodies alone, they tested spirits. The gnawing of the stomach was matched by the gnawing of doubt. Imagine a mother counting the ribs on her child's thin frame, whispering reassurances she herself barely believed. Imagine hunters returning empty-handed, their shoulders heavy with shame as the fire flickered on hollow faces. For the children of this tribe, hunger was the only world they had ever known. They would measure their lives not in years or seasons, but in meals, when they came, how long they lasted, and how quickly they disappeared again. And yet, there were moments of strange resilience. One can picture the tribe finding sweetness in tiny victories. A rabbit snared, a clutch of bird eggs stumbled upon, a cache of edible berries discovered after days of searching. In such moments, laughter returned briefly, and the ache of hunger eased enough for children to play, for stories to be told, for life to feel more than endurance. Mainstream evidence supports this image of fragile resilience. At sites like Border Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found remains of charred seeds and plants, suggesting that even in bleak times, people managed to forage successfully. A quirky detail, some of these seeds show signs of intentional roasting, which not only made them edible, but hinted at early culinary creativity, proof that even in hunger, humans sought to make food more than fuel. Still, the spectre of hunger never retreated. It lingered in every decision, every step, every breath. The tribe had entered a world where survival was no longer about thriving in abundance, but about enduring the absence of plenty. Each day became a hollow day, but a day nonetheless, and in that fragile continuity, humanity's story continued to inch forward. Hardy, tools of desperation. When hunger gnawed and the land offered little, survival depended on the ingenuity carried in human hands. For this small tribe, tools became not luxuries but lifelines. Each shard of stone, each carved bone, each scrap of sinew was pressed into service, crafted and recrafted until nothing more could be squeezed from it. This was not the age of polished invention, but of desperate necessity, yet out of desperation came innovation. Archaeologists studying sites along Africa's coasts and river valleys have uncovered stone blades from this period, thin and sharp as a fingernail, designed to be hafted onto wooden shafts. Known as microliths, these tools allowed hunters to arm themselves with spears and arrows fine enough to bring down smaller, quicker prey when larger animals had vanished. Imagine a hunter kneeling on the cold ground, chipping stone with quiet determination, sparks flying as one flake after another fell away. A single successful tool might mean a rabbit on the fire, or it might mean nothing at all, but still they chipped. Bones, too, became instruments of survival. From long animal bones, women carved awls and needles. These slender tools pierced hides, stitching together clothing and shelters to ward off the chill. At sites like Blombos Cave, archaeologists have found evidence of such bone points, hinting that even amid hunger, humans took the time to craft garments. One quirky detail: some needles show signs of polish, as though the maker cared not only for function but for feel, smoothing the shaft until it slid easily through skin and sinew. Perhaps in the midst of hardship, even the texture of a tool could bring a faint sense of control. The fireside became a workshop. Flint cores lay scattered, bone shards piled nearby, sinew strips stretched taut to dry. Children watched with wide eyes, learning to knap stone and thread sinew. Long before they were old enough to wield the weapons themselves. These were lessons not of luxury but of survival, passed down as urgently as the sharing of food, Without tools, the tribe had no teeth against the wild, no claws against the cold. Scholars still debate whether the innovations of this era were born directly out of the Toba catastrophe, or whether they were simply part of the steady march of human ingenuity that happened to coincide with crisis. Some argue that necessity drove rapid bursts of creativity, that the crucible of survival forged new technologies. Others caution that we should not overstate the drama. Humanity may have been inventive already, and the tools we find were simply what any clever hunter-gatherer would have made in time. The truth, as always, may lie somewhere in between. Yet what cannot be denied is that these fragile instruments, stone blades, bone needles, sinew ties, were more than tools. They were threads in a larger net of survival. A rabbit snare fashioned from twisted fibre might stretch the tribe's food supply by a day. A stitched hide cloak might keep a child alive through a freezing night. And each tool, once made, carried within it not only the knowledge of its maker, but the possibility of hope. One can almost picture the moment, a spear tipped with flint flies across the air, striking true, and for a night the tribe's fire burns brighter, the pot bubbles fuller, the children's laughter returns. For a fleeting time, the ache of hunger eases, carried away on the strength of a tool crafted in desperation. Stories in the darkness. In the long nights when hunger gnawed and cold pressed in, survival was not only about food or fire, it was also about meaning. Around a flickering hearth, the tribe wove together something as vital as roots or marrow, stories. Words, after all, could feed the spirit when the body starved. They gave shape to fear, hope to despair, and unity to a fragile band living at the very edge of existence. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers remind us that storytelling is not mere entertainment. It is instruction, memory, and glue. It binds a community across generations. In those darkened millennia after the Toba eruption, one can imagine the elders speaking in low tones while children leaned close, their eyes reflecting the firelight. They told of days when the sky was brighter, when the rivers ran clearer, when animals roamed the plains in numbers so vast the earth seemed to shake. These memories, half history and half dream, reminded listeners that the world had once been generous and perhaps could be again. But new tales were born too, shaped by the catastrophe itself. Perhaps the mountain that erupted became, in their myth, an angry spirit or a god of fire. Perhaps the endless ash was described as a blanket laid over the world by a jealous sky. Stories helped them grapple with the incomprehensible. A quirky idea, sometimes whispered in anthropological circles, is that myths of fire and shadow pass down across cultures, whether in Aboriginal tales of skyfire or Hindu legends of world cycles, might carry faint echoes of disasters like Toba. Scholars still debate whether such cultural memories can stretch tens of thousands of years, but the possibility is tantalizing. That somewhere in our oldest myths lies a faint record of the darkest winter humanity ever endured. Around the fire, stories also served practical ends. A tale might anchor, owed knowledge, which plants could be eaten, which animals to avoid, which stars pointed the way to distant water. In oral cultures, myth and fact are not separate boxes, they are interwoven. A child might learn of a hero who braved the ash fields, and in that tale remember which landmarks marked a safe path through them. Knowledge survived not in writing, but in rhythm, rhyme, and repetition. Even more, stories kept despair at bay. In silence, hunger feels louder. In fear, the dark feels thicker. But when voices rose in song or tale, the night softened. One can picture the tribe gathered, their faces hollow but their eyes alight, as an elder gestured dramatically, describing spirits who battled in the sky, or animals who tricked death itself. The children laughed, the adults smiled faintly, and for a while the weight of survival lifted. Modern science even gives this ritual weight. Psychologists argue that storytelling strengthens social bonds and increases cooperation. For a tribe as small as this one, such bonds were not luxuries, they were the difference between life and extinction. Without shared meaning, without trust and hope, the group might fracture. With them, it held together, passing through the storm as one. And so, amid the ashes and the hunger, stories burned as brightly as fire. They were invisible tools, shaping minds as surely as stone blades shaped meat. In them lived the memory of loss and the promise of dawn. Humanity's survival was not only written in bones and blood, but in words carried across generations. Even in the darkest nights they whispered, "We are still here." Paths through ice and ash. The tribe could not remain still forever. The land around them, once meagre but survivable, grew leaner with each passing season. Rivers choked with ash, forests withered into husks, and the animals that had once skirted their camp thinned into memory. To stay in place was to wait for death. And so, with cautious determination, they began to move, one fragile band wandering through a scarred world in search of safer ground. Archaeologists studying migration patterns suggest that after the Toba eruption, some human groups travelled great distances, seeking regions where ash fell thinner or where coastal resources could still be harvested. Southern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula have emerged as candidates for such refuges. The tools and hearths found at these sites hint at bands of people moving, adapting, and surviving. Our imagined tribe, then, was not alone in their wandering, though each group's path was uncertain, shaped by luck, instinct, and the stubborn will to live. Movement itself was perilous. Imagine trudging across a plain where every step kicks up grey dust that clings to skin and stings the eyes. Children cry, coughing as they walk. Hunters scan the horizon, spears ready, though prey is rarely seen. Nights are colder away from the safety of their old camp, and every fire must be rebuilt from scratch. Yet the decision to move carried its own logic. To remain in one place was to consume what little food remained. To move was to gamble on the unknown. One quirky piece of evidence comes from obsidian tools found far from their volcanic sources. These stones, prized for their sharp edges, seem to have been carried hundreds of kilometres, exchanged from hand to hand. It suggests that even in this harsh age, humans may have travelled or traded over long distances. Perhaps the tribe, too, carried treasured stones or shells from their hoes. Meland, talismans of memory and continuity, even as the world forced them onward. But scholars still debate the exact paths of survival. Did humanity cling mostly to coasts, feasting on shellfish and seaweed, their footprints washed away by rising tides, or did some press inland, following rivers into greener valleys untouched by ash? The truth may be that both strategies unfolded, with different groups carving out their own tenuous refuges. What matters is not certainty, but that movement itself became a strategy, a refusal to accept the shrinking circle of the familiar. For the tribe, migration was also ritual. Each departure marked a farewell, to a riverside where children once played, to a grove where elders were buried, to a cave that sheltered them from storms. Leaving these behind was not merely practical, but emotional. Yet it was also an act of resilience. By carrying their stories, their tools, and their kin forward, they carried their world within them, even when the land beneath their feet changed, and sometimes, against the odds, the path rewarded them. A new valley where tubers still grew, a river where fish glimmered beneath the ash, a stretch of coastline where mussels clung thick upon the rocks. These discoveries did not erase hardship, but they offered reprieve, enough to keep the tribe walking, enough to convince them that survival was still possible. The world after Toba was not welcoming. It was fractured, unpredictable, hostile, yet by moving through it, the tribe refused to vanish. Each step across ash and ice was a defiance, a quiet declaration: we will not stop here. Allies and strangers. Wandering through a wounded world, the tribe eventually discovered that they were not entirely alone. In valleys spared the worst of the ash, or along coasts where the sea still offered food, other human groups endured. Some encounters were fleeting, a glimpse of figures on a ridge, the faint smoke of another campfire on the horizon. Others drew closer, shaping the fragile bonds of kinship or the sharp edge of rivalry. Mainstream anthropology tells us that during this period, early humans were not a single uniform population. Small, scattered groups lived across Africa and Asia, each with their own dialects, customs, and survival strategies. Archaeological traces, similar stone tools in distant regions, shared fire-making techniques, suggest a loose web of contact and cultural exchange. But contact could be double-edged. A new group might mean fresh knowledge, fresh blood, and fresh alliances. It could also mean competition for the same dwindling resources. Imagine the tension of a first meeting. The tribe, hungry but wary, edges forward across an ashen plain. They spot strangers camped by a river, their bodies wrapped in hides, their children clinging to mothers' legs. Do they approach with open hands, offering a shard of stone or a share of shellfish? Or do they hang back, spears clutched tightly, remembering that desperation can make allies turn to enemies in an instant? One quirky suggestion from ethnographers is that the act of gift-giving, offering a piece of food, a tool, or even a story, may have been one of the oldest strategies to prevent conflict. The exchange was not just practical, but symbolic, a way of saying, "We come in peace, we recognize your humanity." Perhaps the tribe, on meeting strangers, offered a roasted root or a small piece of sharpened flint, and in return received something just as precious: trust. Still, scholars debate whether cooperation or conflict defined these encounters. Some argue that survival demanded alliances, that without interbreeding and sharing of resources, humanity's population would have been too small to recover. Others counter that rivalry was inevitable, that in times of famine, groups guarded their territories fiercely, and strangers were more threat than salvation. Archaeological evidence of violence, fractured skulls, embedded spear points, hints that both paths were possible. Humanity's story has always balanced between kinship and conflict, and in the crucible of Toba's aftermath, the stakes were higher than ever. For our imagined tribe, both experiences likely came. Perhaps they found cousins among strangers, merging families to grow stronger, exchanging stories and songs that enrich their own traditions. And perhaps they also faced hostility, driven away from watering holes or ambushed at hunting grounds. Each encounter carried risk, but also possibility. These meetings were not just about survival in the moment. They shaped the genetic and cultural legacy of humanity. The intermingling of small groups may explain why, despite the bottleneck, human diversity eventually flourished. The echoes of those ancient alliances, those shared meals beside fragile fires, still ripple through our DNA today. And so, wandering through lands scarred by ash, the tribe found themselves part of a larger mosaic. Not isolated, but connected by fragile threads, sometimes woven in harmony, sometimes torn in struggle. In the shadow of catastrophe, they learned that survival was never solitary. To endure meant navigating the delicate dance of allies and strangers. The children of ash, in the tribe's wandering, amid hunger and ash, a new generation was born. They came into the world without memory of the days before the eruption, without the comparison of abundance or bright skies. To them, dim light, thin meals, and endless movement were normal. These were the children of ash, raised in a world remade by fire. Archaeological studies of early human remains reveal the harsh toll such conditions took. Bones from this period often show signs of malnutrition, bowed legs from vitamin deficiencies, fragile teeth worn down too early, and growth lines in enamel, scars of interrupted childhoods. Imagine a toddler stumbling through the soot, ribs visible beneath thin skin, yet laughing all the same at the spark of a fire or the chase of a lizard. For their parents, every laugh was a fragile triumph, proof that even in hardship, life persisted. Mainstream research suggests that despite the dire conditions, humans did not stop having children. In fact, childbirth itself may have been a deliberate act of resilience, a refusal to surrender to extinction. Each new baby was a gamble, another mouth to feed, but also another chance for survival. For the mothers of the tribe, pregnancy was both hope and terror. Without reliable food, the risks were immense, and many births ended in tragedy. Yet those who survived carried the tribe's legacy forward, their cries echoing against the silent ash plains. Quirky evidence comes from ornaments discovered in ancient campsites, perforated shells, beads carved from bone, even bits of ochre worn smooth by handling. Scholars believe these may have been used to adorn children, a gesture of care in a world of scarcity. Perhaps parents decorated their infants not because they had the luxury, but because they needed to affirm beauty, to remind themselves that these fragile lives mattered. Scholars still debate whether the hardships of the Toba aftermath shaped human psychology itself. Did the children raised in scarcity develop sharper resilience, deeper cooperation, or keener innovation? Some anthropologists argue that generations raised in crisis may have accelerated the development of social bonds, empathy, and storytelling traditions. Others caution against romanticizing suffering. Many children surely did not survive at all, and those who did carried the marks of deprivation for life. Yet it is undeniable that these children, frail as they were, became the bridge between past and future. Around them, parents and elders told stories, passing down not only survival skills, but also the meaning of endurance. These children learned to nap stone before they could run, to recognize edible roots before they could speak in full sentences. They grew up not waiting for the world to return to abundance, but accepting that survival itself was the measure of success. One can picture an evening by the fire, a group of children tracing patterns in the ash with sticks, while an elder recited a tale of ancestors and spirits. Their small voices chimed in, repeating refrains, absorbing both knowledge and identity. They were not merely surviving, they were being shaped into the carriers of humanity's memory. And so the children of ash grew, thin, hungry, but alive. They became the proof that even after the sky had darkened and the world had withered, life found a way to continue. In their fragile laughter and their stumbling steps, the future of our species quietly took root. Signals in the bones. Tens of thousands of years later, the story of that fragile tribe and others like it can still be read, not in words or inscriptions, but in bones, stones, and ash. Archaeologists and geneticists today sift through the remains of those who endured the Toba catastrophe, piecing together clues about how humanity survived when the world seemed intent on erasing us. The record is fragmentary, fragile, but astonishingly eloquent. At sites such as Border Cave and Pinnacle Point in South Africa, layers of hearth ash, stone tools, and animal bones provide direct evidence of life during and after the eruption. Tiny cuts on bones reveal the precision of stone blades, while cracked marrow cavities tell of desperate extraction of every last nutrient. The very debris of survival, discarded shells, charred roots, splintered bones, becomes, for us, a record of resilience. Each fragment is a signal across time, whispering that people lived here, fought here, endured here. In human remains themselves, the signals are sharper still. Paleopathologists studying skeletons from this era find unmistakable scars of hardship. Teeth often bear linear grooves, enamel hypoplasia, formed when childhood malnutrition halted growth for weeks or months. Bones sometimes show shortened stature or evidence of anemia. These silent witnesses tell us that hunger was not occasional but systemic, stretching across generations. Yet they also tell us of survival. These individuals lived long enough for the signs of deprivation to etch themselves into their very bodies. A quirky twist comes from genetics. Modern humans today carry remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other species, a fact that suggests a bottleneck in our past. Some geneticists argue that the Toba eruption was responsible, reducing our population to perhaps a few thousand breeding individuals. Others counter that the bottleneck may have other causes, or that Toba's impact was less uniform. Scholars still debate whether our DNA bears the fingerprint of that supervolcano, or whether its role in shaping us has been exaggerated. But even in the uncertainty, the very debate highlights how close we may have come to vanishing. Other signals come not just from bones and genes, but from what was left behind. In caves, archaeologists have discovered fragments of ochre engraved with abstract designs, geometric lines that seem to represent some of humanity's earliest symbolic expression. Were these doodles of idle hands, or were they deliberate attempts to create meaning in a shattered world? Some researchers argue that symbolic thought may have flourished precisely because of crisis, that when survival grew most precarious, humans turned inward, expressing resilience through art and ritual. It is humbling to think that the tribe's struggles, their hunger and their migrations, were etched so deeply that echoes remain in our bodies today. Our shared genetic code carries hints of that bottleneck, while our archaeological record holds the everyday remnants of their fight for life. The marrow-scarred bones, the worn teeth, the smoke-darkened caves, all are signals that even in the harshest conditions, humanity refused to disappear. For us, looking back across 74 millennia, these traces are not just data points. They are voices, faint but insistent, reminding us that we are descendants of survivors. Every laugh, every invention, every community today stands on the foundation laid by those who lived in hunger, who stitched hides in the dark, who carried children across ash plains. Their signals, preserved in bone and stone, still pulse through time, proof that they endured, and that from endurance we were born. Debates of survival. Even as archaeologists and geneticists gather signals from bones, tools, and DNA, one question continues to spark debate. Just how close did humanity come to extinction after the Toba eruption? Was our survival a razor's edge miracle, or have later generations exaggerated the drama of the past? Mainstream science has long leaned toward the near-extinction theory. The scale of Toba's eruption was unprecedented. Ash clouds circled the globe, temperatures fell for years, ecosystems collapsed. Genetic studies suggest a dramatic reduction in human diversity around this time, pointing to a bottleneck of perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals. This interpretation paints Toba as the great trial of our species, the moment when survival hinged on scattered bands of people holding out in marginal refuges. But not all scholars agree. Recent excavations in India, for example, uncovered stone tools both below and above the Toba ash layer. If these were made by the same population, it suggests that humans there survived the eruption without catastrophic collapse. Similarly, coastal sites in Africa show continuous occupation, implying that some groups may have weathered the disaster with relative stability. Scholars still debate whether the genetic bottleneck truly aligns with Toba, or whether other pressures, like shifting climates or disease, played a greater role. A quirky twist to this debate lies in oral traditions. Some anthropologists wonder if myths of endless nights, angry mountains or world-ending fires might preserve faint echoes of Toba's aftermath. Others argue that we must be cautious. Myths can emerge independently of real events, shaped by universal fears rather than specific memories. The possibility that fragments of Toba survive in our oldest stories is tantalizing, but it remains unproven. The disagreements are not mere academic quibbles. They shape how we understand humanity itself. If Toba nearly extinguished us, then every person alive today descends from a handful of survivors bound together by a common narrow inheritance. If instead its impact was severe but patchy, then humanity's resilience lay not in a single narrow escape, but in the diversity of strategies, coastal foraging, inland migration, cultural innovation, that allowed different groups to persist in different places. In truth, the answer may be both. Some regions may have suffered devastating collapses, while others endured with relative success. Survival may have depended not on luck alone, but on the willingness of small tribes to adapt, to eat new foods, to move to new lands, to form alliances when possible, to endure when not. What is certain is that Toba left its mark. Whether it nearly ended humanity or merely scarred it deeply, it shaped the trajectory of our species. For the tribe we have followed, the debates of modern scholars are distant echoes. They could not know the scale of what they faced, nor the debates it would stir in the far future. For them, survival was not a theory, but a lived reality. Hunger, migration, kinship, and the relentless choice to continue. Whether they were among a few thousand or one of many more, their struggle became part of the fabric that carried humanity through. And so the debates continue in our time, even as their endurance continues in our blood. The truth may never be fully resolved, but perhaps that uncertainty itself is fitting, for what mattered most was not how many survived, but that some did. And from their persistence, every life today is descended. The long dawn. At last, after years that must have felt like centuries to those who lived them, the world began to change. The sky, once a shroud of ash and gloom, slowly lightened. Sunlight pierced through with greater strength, warming the soil and coaxing life back into long barren fields. Rivers ran clearer, and shoots of green began to creep across the grey landscapes. For the tribe that had wandered through hunger and darkness, these small shifts carried the weight of miracles. Mainstream climatology tells us that after the Toba eruption, recovery was slow but inevitable. Ash eventually settled into soils, enriching some with minerals that would, in time, make them fertile again. Forests regrew, animals returned in cautious herds, and seas once again teemed with fish. The volcanic winter gave way to a gradual thaw, a long dawn that marked not only the recovery of ecosystems, but also the renewal of human hope. Imagine the tribe waking to a morning when the air was less bitter, when birdsong returned after years of silence. Picture hunters following fresh tracks, finding antelope grazing where once there had been only dust. Children, who had grown up under grey skies, might have laughed in wonder at the brightness of sunlight, squinting against a brilliance they had never seen before. To them, it must have seemed as if the world itself had been reborn. In this renewal, humanity found not only sustenance, but opportunity. The lessons learned in hardship, the crafting of tools, the binding power of stories, the forging of alliances, did not vanish with the return of plenty. They endured, becoming the cultural inheritance that strengthened the species. Some scholars argue that this period of scarcity acted as a crucible, sharpening human ingenuity and social cohesion in ways that later fueled the great migrations out of Africa. Others debate whether such grand narrative has placed too much weight on catastrophe. Yet scholars still debate whether Toba was the singular trial that defined us, or simply one of many trials along the road. What is clear is that by the time the skies brightened, humanity had grown tougher, more adaptive, more deeply bound together. A quirky reminder of resilience can be seen in the Great Caldera itself. Today, Lake Toba fills the wound left by the eruption, its placid waters fringed by villages, fields, and ferries. Children swim where once the earth tore itself open. Tourists take photos of sunsets reflected in waters that 74,000 years ago were born from fire and ruin. It is a living symbol of recovery. From devastation, new beauty emerges. For the tribe, the long dawn was not the end of struggle. Hunger still lingered, dangers persisted, and life remained fragile. But the return of warmth, of green, of plenty, gave them something they had not felt in years, the luxury of imagining a future. Children born in the ash years would grow into adults under brighter skies. New generations would rise, carrying forward the memory of darkness, but also the knowledge that even the deepest night can give way to dawn. And so, from the edge of extinction, humanity stepped forward into renewal. The world that had nearly silenced them now offered its song again. Their fires, once symbols of defiance, now became hearths of continuity. From this fragile dawn, the long arc of human history would unfold. Conclusion. 74,000 years ago, the Earth tested humanity with one of its fiercest trials. The Toba supervolcano darkened skies, froze landscapes, and reduced our numbers to the barest thread. Yet through hunger, migration, and the fragile bonds of kinship, our ancestors endured. They crafted tools from stone and bone, wove meaning into stories told by firelight, and taught their children resilience amid ash and silence. Whether their survival was narrow or broader than we imagine, the truth remains. Every person alive today carries their legacy. The tribe that walked through ice and ash, that shared roots and marrow, that watched children grow thin but still laughed in the darkness, became the bridge between a broken world and the long dawn of renewal. From their endurance, our history began anew,